virtual, but here I am. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm the director, I'm Shadi Salehi, I'm the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, and I'm joined here with my colleague Philip Lee, President and CEO of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. How was that? Just, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down on how was that trust reflection for folks? I see some thumbs up. Thank you for taking some time to reflect on that. So why trust? Why reflect on trust? Really at the core of this, it's this idea of working in collaboration, whether it's in our personal lives or in our professional work, inherently requires trust. But somehow when you think about it, the traditional practices and structures within the institution of philanthropy seem to be more built on suspicion than they are built on trust. And Sydney really highlighted a lot of the need for why this current moment is underscoring the importance of trusting the leadership and the vision of communities and leaders on the front lines of multiple pandemics that we are experiencing right now. And philanthropy is a sector with some deeply, deeply embedded power dynamics. And this suspicion-based practices are doing nothing to advance this vision for equity, justice, and democratic participation. So the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project was founded to really fill that need, to respond to this culture of distrust that's been built in our sector, and instead offer a clear path forward and a vision of leading with trust, with concrete practices that can really help foster that practices that center the relationship, and ultimately really allowing for foundations and nonprofits equally to be more effective, and valuing and trusting the leadership of organizations, especially those that are often overlooked or undervalued because they don't fit that image, the dominant image of what the sector deems as trustworthy. So this is why we're here. We're thrilled to be partnering with the Philanthropy Network. We hope this will be one of many conversations. Today we're going to hear from a number of practitioners that are living and breathing trust-based practice as they kind of learn and deepen this journey. It's not a checklist. As it came up in my breakout group, you know, building trust is a constant process, and it requires cultivation, and it takes time. But it can really yield some amazing benefits for those involved. So if, Sydney, if you can take off the screen and we can just go back to video. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Phil Lee of the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. And Phil is also one of the co-founders of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. So Phil, can you share for us just the reasoning behind trust-based philanthropy and why you really felt the need to get behind this initiative?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be with you. I'm sorry it's not in person. As someone who went to college and grad school in Philly, it would be nice to be there and join all of you. But hello from Brooklyn, New York. Interestingly, my journey to trust-based probably comes in two different ways that probably are part of this journey. And when I got out of college, I ended up going to work in financial services and went to Wall Street and spent the first half of my career there. And I think one of the things that we did when I was making loans or rating bonds and things of that nature is really looking at a holistic nature of an organization and what it can do, looking at management, looking at the teams, looking at resources and the strategies, and really thinking like, do we think that this organization can deliver on what it says it wants to do? And so that is a way that kind of we looked, or I looked at kind of the world from that point of view in terms of understanding kind of how organizations work. And then halfway through that, I went through a leadership development program here in New York, and got exposed to people who were doing work in lots of different ways. And ultimately, I left kind of the world of finance and actually went to lead this organization called Coro. And it was in that role as a grant seeker that I had a chance to experience what it means to apply for apply for grants and work with foundations and other folks who provide resources. And that was an eye-opener for me in terms of just understanding the challenges of what that looks like, the hoops that can happen, the myriad of questions, the variety of applications. And it was really one of those things that saying, wow, I am spending almost all of my time trying to deal with this as a foundation, as a nonprofit leader. And I think what happened is, as I kind of navigated that career, I came to the world of philanthropy about 10 years ago, and mostly it was using my finance hat, right? Working as the chief financial officer for foundations and things like that. But 4 years ago, I came to the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation and was invited to kind of think about how we would do our work. And I drew on those experiences to help inform the way that I would want to engage with grantee partners. And so what we started thinking about was like, what if we did general operating support or unrestricted funding and did multi-year support to give organizations the flexibility to do their work and not have to worry about applying every single year and being judged in that way? And what if the processes were streamlined in a way that I could actually focus on the work and not focus on cutting and pasting and rearranging applications to do that work? And so it was really sort of carrying those ideas and talking to folks about what that could look like when a colleague sort of said, you should talk to the Whitman Institute. And I just sort of looked a little puzzled. I don't know who they are. And what she said was, oh, they're doing a lot of the work that you're talking about. And so ended up talking to the co-directors, Pia Infante and John Esterly. And they shared kind of their vision and the different principles around what they call trust-based philanthropy. And basically, off of that conversation and then bringing it back and talk to our board, we went back and said, we would love to adopt, and you have thought about this in ways that we haven't even considered, but would you be okay if we adopted that language and called our work trust-based as well? And they said yes, and so we became the first follower. So that's our story into trust-based, and we've been doing it for 4 years, ever since I came to the foundation.
Thanks, Phil. Can you share a little bit about how, basically what's in it for Robert Sterling Clark Foundation to practice in this way? We know that it yields a lot of benefits for nonprofits, but how are you as a funder learning and benefiting as a result of adopting these practices?
Sure. I think that one of the biggest things that changes is our role as a funder, right? Or the roles that we have as staff and program officers in terms of doing the work. And I think often, if you think about it, it can be compliance or making sure everything's dotted and crossed, if you will. But I think it invites us into a different kind of relationship with our grantee partners, and that we can either be counsel or we can be advisors, or we can help think about things in different ways. And it's been an interesting journey because it's not the most natural thing, because there's much more of like a guarded, if you will, or sometimes adversarial relationship that can exist between grantees and their funders. But I think it's been really interesting and powerful for us to be able to learn more about what's happening in the sector, what's happening with our grantees, and it helps us be better informed in terms of our grant making. And so we learn more so that we can be more thoughtful and we can do hopefully better work in terms of serving them and the communities.
Thank you, Phil. We often talk about power in the context of trust-based philanthropy. So this notion that there's these inherent power imbalances that exist in the sector. Can you speak to that? You know, how does a trust-based approach operate to alleviate power imbalance, and how do you see that showing up? What are some ways that funders can be more intentional about addressing those power imbalances?
I think power is just inherent in the system, if you will, right? Those that have the resources have the power, and that's how it plays out. And certainly that was one of the big things coming and thinking about how we would do our work differently when I came to Robert Sterling Clark. That really helped. That was really a defining thing about, you have this power, and whether it's earned or warranted or deserved is questionable, but it comes with the territory. And honestly, my own experience with being a grant seeker and just sort of being in the field and working on the ground is that it's often the grantees that have a much better understanding of what needs to happen or what's going on. And so really acknowledging that we have power, right, that come with those resources, but a lot of the expertise sits in different places. And so I would say that funded nonprofits, they're definitely the same system and they have complementary roles to play in different ones. And so for us, really sort of saying, we trust that you know how to deploy these resources, how to make the right decisions on how to move forward and serve your community is a big statement. And so I think that's where the general operating multi-year comes in, is really like, please go do your work and don't worry about us. Your job is to work and serve your community, not to worry about the funders that are doing that work, providing the resources.
Yeah, the multi-year unrestricted funding really does send a strong signal of trust and doesn't automatically trigger a trusting relationship between funder and grantee, but can pave the way for that. In my breakout, we talked a little bit about the role of boards, and I'm curious if you can share with your reflections with the group on what does a board's role look like in a trust-based context?
Sure, I think it's interesting. In our small group, I ended up talking about our board as well. Often I think people think of trust-based philanthropy as just the actual grant-making process, right? So we do a streamlined process or what have you. But the reality is that to be able to do that, I think it's really kind of an ecosystem, if you will, of the board and the board's relationship with the staff's relationship with one another and with colleagues and peers in the field, and then also the foundation's relationship with the grantees. And I think they all have to work in concert with one another, because if you don't have that, you can't just sort of have one part do this work and sort of say that this is embedded or these are the values, if you will, of the organization. And I think Trustbase is really an expression of your values, or values in action, if you will. And that's really kind of what this is about. And for us, the board and its belief and trust in us as the staff is really an important part of this decision making. And we've seen it happen during this moment with COVID and with kind of the racial justice conversations and protests. And so it's really an important thing that getting our board on aligned with us and believing that this is the right way to move forward too has been important. And so I think we had the benefit of people had good questions, but people will also, a number of our board members also sit on the boards of nonprofits, and so have an understanding of what that challenge is and what nonprofits we're also looking for. And then we've had a couple of nonprofit leaders sit on our board as well, and so they would be able to really share the lived experience of what it means to be a grant seeker. And so all of those things combined helped our board kind of move towards a more trust-based practice.
I'm told we have a few more minutes, and I want to acknowledge that you have been an advocate for trust-based philanthropy for a few years now. And curious, what are some of the most common misconceptions that come up when you're talking about trust-based philanthropy?
There are lots of, and they're good questions, and there's a lots of pushback. I think when you hear trust, and many people think of trust as like you think about your close friends or people that you go to when you have things going on. And I think a lot of people, I think, conflate trust-based philanthropy is like giving money to your friends or people that you know. And I would sort of separate that it's not trust for friendship or trust for likability. It's actually trust for action, right? We trust that you will do what you're saying that you want to do or you plan to do in serving the community. And I think that's probably the biggest one, is really understanding that it's not because I know you and because I like you that you're getting the funds. But it's related to the second one. I think because of that notion that it's often given to people that you know, my favorite phrase is that we give money away willy-nilly. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think there is a rigor that goes into this, because it's the onus, and that's one of the principles, is to do the homework is up to us as the funder and to really get to know the organization and what it's doing. And for our board to get comfortable with that, you know, we have to do our homework, and we have the opportunity to get to know the organization better I will say it's not as easy the first time because we're a bit of an outlier, right? This is a different approach, and that's not the norm that most people experience. And so it actually is something that evolves over time. But I think the rigor question often comes up, and then the last one would be impact, and where people are like, how can you measure general operating or multi-year, and how do you do these metrics? And honestly, Trustbase is a real pushback, I think, on some of the strategic philanthropy metrics, if you will, or the obsession with that. And it's interesting as the finance guy to be on the other side of that equation at this point. But if we're really going to honor the nonprofits and their work, it's really about asking them, so what are your goals? How do you assess yourself? How does your board look at what success looks like? And we use that as a springboard for a conversation and understanding of what that means. And then secondly, I would say, when you are in a trust-based kind of relationship, the metrics can be different, right? And I think trying to put them in a container that we're used to looking at, or a framework that way, isn't necessarily the right one. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that and measure what trust looks like, if you will. We call it return on relationship. But it's a different way of sort of trying to capture, like, are we really being good funders, and are we serving our grantees in a good way?
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership on all of that. Just a little plug, we are sharing some of those templates from Robert Sterling Clark Foundation soon on the Trust-Based Philanthropy website, so you can check that out for more tools. So the theme of today is a trust-based future for philanthropy. So final question for you, Phil. Given the vision of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project to make trust-based practices the norm, what would that look like? What does that trust-based future look like?
Part of it is we wouldn't even be talking about this, right? And we wouldn't use trust-based because this would be the way that philanthropy does its work, right? And I think so much of this is around kind of power mitigation, or sharing, or ceding power, and really honoring kind of the different roles that we have in the sector, and realizing that the nonprofits have a lot of lived experience and expertise to work on the ground, and we have the resources, and we can see a big picture too. And so we can work in concert with one another. And so hopefully kind of a trust-based process lets us have more information flowing more freely, and that we can sort of work in a collaboration with one another to sort of really serve and help our communities in a better way. And I think if we can do that, then we don't need to have all this other time spent worrying about kind of the funding equation as a huge part of the equation, but it can be just a component of it. But the real work is where we can focus our energies, and that's where I think the biggest benefit comes from.
Thank you, Phil. Let's all give a virtual round of applause to Phil. Thanks so much. Thank you. I'm gonna use my jazz hands. We are going to transition over to our panel discussion. So I'll ask for the next slide to be advanced. Thanks again, Phil. Thank you. Okay, so we heard a lot about kind of this broad strokes of what a trust-based ecosystem, you heard Phil mention that. And a lot of the values that you heard us talk about are really kind of core concepts of a trust-based approach. So we're talking about power sharing, equity, humility, transparency, and curiosity and collaboration, a lot of which are really not just values, but also leadership qualities. So entering into the work with a commitment to leading with these values. We often like to talk about the values-based approach before we dig into each of the principles of the actual practical steps of how to embody a trust-based approach, because the practice is greater than the sum of the practical steps. It's about leading with priority on these values first and foremost, and building a culture within your organization that are embedded in that embody these values, but also prioritizing relationships at every level. Like Phil was mentioning, trust kind of flows at multiple levels, from board to staff, from staff to grantee partners to communities. And this is kind of, we see this as an ecosystem. This work gets advanced through relationship, and trust-based relationships can ultimately help us advance more trust-based organizations, and hopefully ultimately a more inclusive and just and equitable world and society. Next slide, please. So there are 6 principles to a trust-based approach. These are kind of the practical steps. So these are the practical offerings of, what does it look like to actually embody a trust-based approach in your day-to-day practice? So you heard a lot of these in Phil's remarks. Multi-year unrestricted funding, because that really helps signal that there's trust for the leadership of those who are making the decisions and doing the work, and recognizing that those who are closest to the issues are most likely best positioned to decide how resources should be allocated. Multi-year funding recognizes that social change and a lot of the work in the social sector takes time. We don't often have immediate wins within a 12-month time period. So this recognizes that work takes time, and committing long-term alleviates nonprofits from having to be stressed and thinking about how they're going to raise money for the next year. Doing the homework puts the onus on funders to actually do some of that due diligence and takes it off of prospective grantees. Simplified paperwork really honors the time of nonprofit leaders, where sometimes some proposals can take up to 35 to 40 hours to write. So this acknowledges that it doesn't need to be that onerous. There's ways that can be streamlined. Communication that is transparent and responsive goes a long way in building a kind of, trust goes both ways. So if you model transparency, that's when you're more likely to get transparency. And then soliciting feedback, again, trusting the leadership and the vision of nonprofit leaders, recognizing that they have valuable input that can shape and inform your work and strategies. And then ultimately support beyond the check. Which recognizes that funders and foundations have a lot of resources and assets to bring to the table beyond just financial resources. You're connected, you've got relationships, there's convening power, there's introductions that can be made. There's a lot that that funders do bring to the table that can be supportive in building a trust-based relationship. So that's just kind of a quick recap. We've got our URL at the bottom of this screen. So you're welcome to check out. We've got more tools that really articulate the rationale behind all of these. But more importantly, I'd love to introduce our panelists now, because we're going to hear how this work shows up locally in Philadelphia. So thank you. So I want to acknowledge that we recognize that these trust-based practices are not new. Certainly you may recognize a lot of these practices in your own organizations. So it's really this collective, and it's the naming of the collective practice that we found a lot of power in the kind of organizing and movement building around advancing this vision of trust-based. And it's also, it's a journey, not a checklist, as we're going to hear from our colleagues today. So coming up, we've got Farah Parks, who is the Executive Director of New Century Trust, along with grantee partner Nadia Hevka, Senior Staff Attorney with Community Legal Services. We'll also hear from Chanel Ransom, Program Officer at the Fells Fund, and Nicole Kleigerman, Director of the Pennsylvania Domestic Workers Alliance. So we're going to take it off screen again, and I will first start off with Chanel and Nicole. So Nicole, with the Pennsylvania Domestic Workers Alliance, can you just start off by sharing the story of how you got started as an organization and Fells Fund's role in helping you get that work off the ground?
Sure. Well, hi, everybody. Shout out to the many of you that I know. So good to see you all. So I am a 5th generation Philadelphian and have been an organizer, both union and immigrant justice organizer in Philly for 10 years. About 2 years ago, I wanted to start organizing domestic workers. So that's mostly women who do house cleaning, nannying, and caregiving work. There hadn't been any domestic worker organizing in the state, and domestic workers are systematically excluded from all local, state, and federal labor protections because domestic work is the work of enslaved women, and that legacy of slavery continues to be enshrined in law. I launched the organization in August of 2018 with after doing kind of an extensive survey project in my free time with domestic workers about the biggest challenges that they face on the job. There's about 16,000 domestic workers in Philly. They make an average of $10,000 a year. And have until recently had no labor protections at work and are at the intersection of just about every kind of marginalization you could imagine. So launched on a very, very shoestring budget, and the FELS grant was actually our first major grant, and it was a belief in the work. It was a belief in domestic workers that they deserve a space to come together and, have their leadership developed and get free together. And they took a chance on us and a belief in the power of domestic workers. We didn't have a proof of concept yet. We knew that it could be done. It had been done in other places. It had never been done in Pennsylvania. So FEL's investment in our work was really, really critical in me being employed after 4-month trial period, and what I think was also an important vote of confidence for many other Philadelphia funders who have gone on to support us, and we're very grateful for that. And I will say that as a result of FEL's investment, as well as other funders, domestic workers, after an organizing for 1.5 years, domestic workers themselves won the Philadelphia Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which provides labor protections for the very first time in Philadelphia history, and it is the strongest law of its kind in the country. And also shout out Nadia, who's also on this panel, who is one of our 2 intrepid local legal partners. I'm an organizer, not a lawyer, from Community Legal Services, and also Farah, who the New Century Trust also supports us. So I really feel like the victory for domestic workers has been a community-based effort led by domestic workers themselves, but supported by the philanthropic and advocacy and legal communities in Philadelphia. And I mean, COVID has hit our members extremely hard at the intersection of race, gender, work, public health. Almost all are undocumented, so don't have access to healthcare. And trying to speak really fast because there's a lot to say. But we're really pleased to have received a multi-year grant from FELS and have won, along with our coalition to respect every worker here in Philadelphia, the Mayoral Worker Relief Fund, which was really supported by the Dowdy Foundation, shout out Jen, to provide direct cash assistance to workers in Philadelphia, not just domestic workers, but workers in Philadelphia who have been excluded from state and federal relief programs because of their immigration status and or because they work in cash. But 2 years ago, we were just a little baby organization that no one had ever thought of, few people had ever thought of domestic workers before, and FEL's front end investment in the leadership of domestic workers played a really catalytic role in being able to get us here today. Is my 2 minutes.
Wow. Thank you, Nicole. That was Nicole Kligerman from the Pennsylvania Domestic Workers Alliance. Talk about return on relationship. That's amazing. I'm going to turn it to Chanel Ransom with FELS Fund. Chanel, what were the deliberations like at FELS when you were approached by Nicole? And what were the conversations you had around kind of, assessing this new kind of startup organization? What did those conversations look like?
Well, hi, everyone. It was a lot of conversations, and it elevated a conversation that we had already been having internally of what on our website, we talk about, we want folks to have dignity, and the domestic workers, from what we were hearing and seeing, that wasn't a life, it didn't feel or sound like a life of dignity. So really, it was an opportunity for us to step up and align in alignment with our beliefs, but also thinking about what does our world look like if we're fighting for justice? What does our world look like without domestic workers and without them having protections, and without folks feeling like they're safe or they have security in their jobs. So the deliberations were around that, but also what does it mean to fund an organization that is new? And is our process too rigorous? Is it just right? And how do we begin to build confidence in the organization as they're stepping out and approaching funders, and what is our role? So not only did we fund, it was the conversation of, okay, you should talk to this funder. Okay, have you thought about this? And beginning to build that relationship. And it's really us building trust, but also Nicole and the domestic workers trusting us. And in the spirit of power sharing, in our meeting, Nicole really did that. So we went to their office, and they had just moved in. It was super bright and lovely, but Nicole invited a domestic worker that was taking the lead and really gave her space to share her story, to share why this work is important, to share what the work actually means. And having that personal story, well, I personally didn't need to be sold. And being able to translate that to the board, that was really important, to be able to share the personal story, to say, like, what does this mean for an individual that this organization exists, as well as what does the big win look like in terms of the policy work. And there's still more work to be done. Getting the policy, the law in place is just the first step. And that rolled into when meeting with Nicole and hearing what what the vision of the organization was and the work that was being laid out. It was like, it's not going to happen in 12 months. And we know that the work is being done. We see you at City Hall. We see what's happening on social media. We see the movement. So let's invest for more than 1 year so that they don't have to worry about us. We can follow what they're doing and say, how can we support you beyond the grant dollars? What does this mean for you? What do you need?
Thank you so much, Chanel. That's such a great example of offering support beyond the check, and also those early relationships and the early conversations were an opportunity to identify values alignment, right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing. Like, there was the kind of conversations early, and the tone by which Nicole came to those meetings really helped establish that, which was kind of the initial groundwork for a trust-based relationship. Nicole, going back to you, as a grantee of Phil's Fund, what does the relationship look like? Like, practically, what does that look like day to day? And how does that kind of help you as a nonprofit leader?
Love to be called a leader sometimes. Both Sarah and Chanel came to our city council hearings and events, and I think that was an important space for them to see our members in action, but also for them to be actually part of the work. You know, those seats and faces in the crowd are really important. Sarah came to our celebration party, which was really great to have her there after we won the Bill of Rights. We've also been connected with domestic workers that are connected to FEL's staff, which has been an opportunity to expand our organizing of domestic workers. So it's not just relegated to that once or twice a year check-in, but really connected to the organizing campaigns, which has been a powerful opportunity for everybody. And for the workers, for our members, it feels good for them to feel invested in. They like coming and sharing their stories with funders and asking for money. It makes them feel powerful because they have a lot of ownership over the organization. I'd also say, just to the points that you had in the slide before, being able to offer there is not a lot of time and capacity, so being able to offer the verbal report back is really helpful. Certainly the multi-year grant is also really, really helpful for us. And even before I even applied for the LOI, being able to talk to Chanel and have a mutual conversation, like, are we a good fit for this granting body before I spend a lot of time. It feels respectful for you to tell me if I'm not, if this isn't going to be a good fit, because it is a lot of time to do, and the time that we spend on grants is time that we're not with our members and out in the field. So I kind of I'm glad that we were eligible, but really appreciate that kind of transparency on the front end. And 2 days ago was the International Domestic Workers Day, and we had a celebration last night via Zoom with it. And our members were sharing, I used to be ashamed to be a house cleaner or a nanny, and now I know my work is dignified like any other job, and I'm so proud that we won the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, and we're still in the fight. So that kind of initial belief supported workers to get to where they are tonight, being really, really proud to be domestic workers.
That's so great. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to your members for doing such amazing work. Final reflection question for you, Chanel. So FELS is on a journey, right? You're on this trust-based journey. Curious, it's kind of a two-part question. What are you learning so far from practicing in this way? And what's next for FELS as you continue to kind of deepen your commitment to a trust-based approach?
Well, it is a journey, and I would underscore, highlight, put it in bold, in caps. There never really feels like a moment of arrival. It's more of keeping an openness and a curiosity of what can be done, and also being open to feedback and being able to act and receive that from our grantees and asking that. So in terms of what is next, there's a lot of things that are up ahead, but want to elevate just a few of them. So one is, we recently updated our website, and we have links to say on our contact page, if you have questions about organizational fit, click this link and schedule time to talk with Sarah or to talk with Chanel, and it gives the funding areas. We also are incorporating feedback into that, and we elevate a grant advisor, and it says, if you want to give us feedback, you can give it to us anonymously here, but also we welcome that when we have conversations with organizations. We try to be as transparent and honest as possible. Like Nicole mentioned up front, that is a practice. Like, we don't want to waste anyone's time, but we also want to hear about the work. If we can't fund it, that doesn't mean that we can't elevate it to other funders, that we can't follow what is going on, be a part of community. And really this idea of, we do the homework, and really looking internally at what are pain points in our application process that's coming up. What do we actually need from a legal standpoint, from an audit standpoint, and then looking at the board, what do they need to vote on decisions, and being able to tailor our application process to that. And then really elevating grantee voice when we go before the board. So a question that we always ask when we meet with applicants is, what are 3 to 4 things that you want to make sure we let the board know about either your work or your organization? And it doesn't matter if we funded you for years or we're funding you for the first time. We really want to ask that question because things are changing all the time. Things are elevating, and we want folks to feel like it is a relationship and that they are in partnership with us and that they do have a voice. It's not a one-way street by any means. And we're not on the ground, so we don't know what is happening in real time, and trust that our partners are giving us that information, and then we're able to bring it back to the funding community or change how we're operating.
Thank you so much, Chanel. Thank you for modeling such trust-based leadership. Thanks for showing us what's possible, and thank you for sharing, the rest of your journey. Really appreciate that. I wanted to note that we're seeing some questions in the chat box. We will have a Q&A portion, but I do invite our panelists, if you want to float in there and respond. Some questions are very specific to the topics that are being raised during the discussion. So I invite you to do that, and we'll do our best to answer those questions either via chat or during the Q&A portion. Next, I want to introduce Nadia Hevka and Farah Parks from Nadia Hevka from the Community Legal Services and Farah Parks from New Century Trust. Another dynamic duo, funder grantee pair. Let's start with you, Nadia. Can you share a bit about the organizing work that you're leading at Community Legal Services and the challenges that you faced in raising money for some of the work that doesn't exactly fit into the kind of legal services category?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this day, and seeing some familiar faces and names on the screens is a great thing. So yeah, I'm a employment lawyer at Community Legal Services. We're an anti-poverty focused legal services organization, and we have the great ability to not only represent individuals and take on legal cases, but also work on some advocacy work. And so in that space of working with low-wage immigrant workers, restaurant workers, et cetera, talking about this particular project that we are working on together with Farah, because actually Farah's group is funding another project at CLS as well, and I can talk to you about that one as well, about the Incarcerated Women's Working Group. But this particular project came together because we were seeing such high rates of sexual harassment in restaurant work, and the legal system is really not the best way sometimes to deal with it. The legal system can deal with a legal case after the fact, but how do you deal with the trauma? How do you make someone whole through the legal system? And how do you prevent sexual harassment from happening? Clearly, our legal system that's set up has not done that, right? We've had protections against sexual harassment since Title VII passed in the late 60s, and then sexual harassment law developed in the 70s and 80s. So we, together with coalition partners, started thinking about creating a new project where restaurant workers would take the lead in talking to other restaurant workers about the issue and see it more as an organizing issue and a workplace rights issue, and rather than just an individual thing that happens to one person because another person was bad. There are power dynamics at play, there are race dynamics at play. Some of the worst cases we saw were undocumented women who were raped on the job, right? And so when sexual harassment goes unaddressed, it can escalate, because that's the way these kinds of interactions can happen. So there's so many things happening there. It's a tough subject. It's a really tough thing to try to tackle. And we thought we had a good solution working with partners in Philly, and came up with this new project called CRUSH, the Coalition for Restaurant Safety and Health, where we work with sexual violence. The sexual violence world and the workers' rights world don't often come together. And trying to figure out a way in the door to talk to workers at restaurants where this whole space of sexual harassment is also, you know how the police are supposed to police themselves? Workplaces also police themselves when it comes to sexual harassment. So you have to complain to your workplace before you can have a legal claim, right? So it's this unique situation where we thought we needed a new solution and came up with one, created trauma-informed sexual harassment trainings, because most sexual harassment trainings are done by management side labor law firms as a way to check off a box and get your insurance, for the employer. So we came up with these trainings. We organized a workers committee of restaurant workers, many of whom, anyone who you talk to in the restaurant world has experienced sexual harassment in a variety of ways, and everyone is impacted by it, even if they haven't felt it. So I could talk about this for a long time. I'm going to try to stop myself from doing that, but I want to say that it was an unusual project, small project, and connecting with funders was a little bit of a challenge, because supervising workers to go out and do organizing work is not something that they just can jump into and do. You need to put some resources into it, and you need to figure out how to get your foot in the door with restaurants as well. So Farah and the New Century Trust knew about community legal services, knew about the work that we were doing in the space of a few different things that we were doing, heard about that project as well as some other projects we were involved with, and helped us get this project off the ground. The project, just as Nicole said, and yeah, we've been working with the Domestic Workers Alliance as well, in the CLS employment unit. Just as she said, that project is now pivoting because so many restaurant workers are out of work, and it's actually a really interesting time where restaurant workers are feeling their power a little bit more as frontline and essential workers who have some leverage, and maybe if they can take action, can do something to make their workplaces safer and therefore the public safer. So figuring out the public component, both in a sexual harassment campaign as well as in any other workplace campaign, it's a little bit different in the restaurant world. But Crush has now pivoted a little bit to give more broad support to restaurant workers who are facing so many different life or death safety issues right now that they're being asked to reopen. But I guess I want to say that you're probably going to ask me about this later, but I want to just say that I'm not a fundraiser, I'm an attorney, so having this kind of relationship is super useful to me because it's a world that I have to rely on other people on in my organization. And when our fundraising team heard about how this process was going to work with New Century, they are so excited about this model because what's really centered is the work that we're doing. And Farah really dives deep into that work and understanding the work and understanding who we're working with, and is able to, I think, just be there more and be at meetings or be at events and understand what we're doing and actually like figure out who else is doing similar work and needs support. So from my perspective as a non-fundraiser, it's been really great having been on other grants that we get from like a government grant. My goodness, all the reports you have to write. So you don't want to hear about that, about that. But I just wanted to say that that's one really, the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about this particular relationship.
Thank you, Nadia. Farah, let's move on to you. Can you share just from your perspective how you approach that grant-making relationship? And did you have to circumvent any concerns about perceived riskiness from your board? Specifically this being kind of organizing work. Just curious what those conversations look like.
Well, New Century Trust does and has, before I started, been focused on doing systems change work. So we are very much in support of organizing. So we also support Nicole's work with the Domestic Workers Alliance and other organizing work. So that wasn't an issue at all. And one of the things that is really great about the way we've implemented the trust-based philanthropy process is in terms of simplifying the grant process. We have a very short grant application. And then we have folks come in for what we call an interview. It's not really an interview, it's more of a conversation, but it's about an hour. And board members, it's me and grantee, but also people they're organizing with. So Nicole brought some of her domestic workers, not her domestic workers, but you know what I mean, the domestic workers she organizes with. And Nadia brought some of the restaurant workers she organizes with. And then we had board members. I tried my best to schedule it so there would be a board member at each meeting, which I almost got, but I think I missed a couple. But the board members are also there hearing this work, hearing about the work directly, and it makes my job easier when I'm trying to present at a board meeting about what the work is. Folks can chime in, and it makes everything more real. And even folks that were, maybe not quite sure why they were being asked, we had a bunch of new board members that came on last fall, and they were kind of like, well, what's my role? I'm like, don't worry about it. Just come, listen. If you have questions, ask questions, but don't worry about it. But it was a really great way to get them up to speed on the work and connected with the work and a lot more comfortable with it. Yeah.
And Farah, are you at New Century Trust? Are you in this type of relationship with all of your grantee partners? And I'm curious, what do you get out of this as a funder practicing in this way?
We do follow a standard format. So we do, have a very simple application process. We do this interview process. Not all of our relationships are as, strong or sort of as evolved as we have with CLS, partly because we fund a bunch of different projects with CLS. So we do, as Nadia mentioned, fund the Incarcerated Women's Working Group, and then they're doing work with the Domestic Workers Alliance. They're also part of a group called CREW, which is a coalition to respect every worker. So I end up hearing about their work and being at City Hall events and that kind of thing a lot. But we do approach all of our grantees the same, which is that we, for most of our grantees, we do give multi-year general operating support. We have a simplified grant process. We really try to connect with them, and if they have other needs, some grantees are not as hurting for cash, and so one of the things that was very clear when I met with Nadia and Natalia and a different Nicole about the project was that they needed more money. And so once we had approved the grant, I was like, we're going to meet and we're going to talk about how we're going to get you the rest of this money. And, I've done that with other groups, just as an on an as needed basis. So it's not one size fits all, but we do sort of all start at the same place with a trust-based approach.
Mm. And how are you learning and benefiting from embracing these types of relationships?
I think we know a lot more about the work. I think we know a lot more about our impact. Our goal as a funder is not to give away money. I mean, it is to give away money, but our goal ultimately is to end gender-based oppression. And we do that by giving away money. But being really connected to the work that folks are doing keeps me really informed about wins, about impact, about upcoming issues, about new ways to think about things, about new folks to fund, about new funding sources. It helps us achieve our mission better because, again, our mission is not to write a check. Our mission is to make change. And I feel much closer to the change doing it this way. And frankly, it's more fun.
Thank you. That is a wonderful point for us to move along to our final reflections from all of our speakers. I want to thank everyone. We're going to move into Q&A and kind of break out reflections in a moment. But I want to offer our speakers an opportunity to share one final reflection or piece of advice in 5 to 10 words. So super short. I'm going to hand it back to Chanel Ransom at Fells Fund. What's your 5 to 10 word reflection or advice for our folks today?
Trust and fund Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations.
Yes, thank you. Yes. All right, Nicole Kligerman from the Pennsylvania Domestic Workers Alliance. What's your 5 to 10 word piece of advice?
Invest in hiring community members in the organizations. I'll be following up with some of you on that.
That's great. And Farah Parks from New Century Trust, what is your advice for the community?
Put the work first, focus on the work, and center that as you're doing philanthropy.
Love that. Thank you. And finally, Nadia Hefka from Community Legal Services. What's your 5 to 10 word bit of advice?
I guess that funding the advocacy and funding the change is really important, and I think that's pretty visible right now.
Thank you. And you all have really demonstrated that in these stories Thank you all. Thank you, Nadia and Nicole and your members for all the amazing work and accomplishments that you've made. Thank you to Chanel Ransom from Fells Fund and Farah Parks from New Century Trust for your trust-based leadership and for modeling this trust-based journey. Thank you for sharing those stories. We are going to move to breakouts. So this is going to be a moment. Do we have a slide for our breakout portion?